Add to stream. There we go. Hello. I saw that Paul put something up yesterday or the day before about C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, which I really love. And so, some free time this afternoon, I thought that I would open a space up if anyone was interested in getting on to talk about Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, or That Hideous Strength. So, let me see here. I need to put the link in the description. Invite. There we go. So we're going to put the link in the description. There we go. So if anybody wants to hop on, this is like book club style. You actually don't have to have read it, I guess. You're happy to, if you just want to talk about it and ask questions. Yeah, why is the space trilogy so interesting to people? Apparently because aliens. No, I've loved the space trilogy for a number of years. They're three very different books. The first two books are the very much mid 20th century sci-fi that are actually they're really deep. They've got a lot that they're saying, unlike some more shallower things. They're also saying things that are really true. So like compared to Isaac Asimov, and Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote interesting books, interesting sci-fi, but like the stuff that they're saying is mostly just garbage. Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra are like they're really rich stories, and theologically, philosophically, you can just see Lewis bringing everything that he's got to bear on trying to tell a sci-fi story. Apparently they came out of him and Tolkien saying that they're going to write science fiction stories each. And I think one of them was going to write a sci-fi story about space and the other one was going to write one about time. And I can't remember who decided to do which. But Tolkien ended up backing out. I think Lewis originally was going to write a sci-fi story mainly about time travel. And that's where The Dark Tower. Is it called The Dark Tower? I think it's called The Dark Tower. It's an unfinished work by him. It's really weird. It's a very, very weird story, and it has all this complicated stuff about like moving between different timelines. They create this apparatus that lets them see like a parallel time, and then the beings on the other side of the apparatus figure out a way to like jump through it. At any rate, he never finished it, and then I think he decided, well, since Tolkien's not in this, I think he said, I'm gonna go ahead and write a sci-fi series about space, and that's where the space trilogy came from. So what's funny is that everyone calls it a space trilogy. Lewis himself, I understand, despised the word space. They should be called his sci-fi trilogy. I prefer his Ransom trilogy. Ransom being his main character, and also because it has to do with ransoming things. Wow, this is amazing. The internet is so weird. I can't believe that there's three people who want to hear me monologue about C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. If anybody wants to get on here and talk about it with me, please feel free to do so. He thought that the heavens were a much better description for what's going on up above Earth. When you read Out of the Silent Planet, the first one, the first thing that he does is to try to rehabilitate this idea of the heavens, that when you get outside of the atmosphere, you're not going into a place of like crushing death and horribleness, which is, it's weird when you think about someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? So Neil deGrasse Tyson seems to think that the heavens, that space is this like really meaningful thing. He approaches it. Obviously he does. He talks about it all the time. He can deny it, which I don't think he would, but he said all he wants to talk about is the universe, right? So clearly he thinks that it's like really something we should be paying attention to. But then everything that he has to say is basically, it's profoundly inhospitable. It'd kill you immediately. It'll break your mind if you try to think about it. Like, it's the description of space by the sort of modern scientific mythology is one that is like deeply anti-human. Like it wants to kill you. That's what it's going to try to do. It's going to try to kill you as fast as possible. And you see this in movies all the time. Like if anyone saw the movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock years back, I mean, that's like space is trying to kill you. That's basically, it's a trope at this point that space is trying to kill you. And so Lewis, what's interesting is when the beginning of Ransom's journey, when he doesn't know where he's going, is the first thing that he realizes is that he finds himself incapable of thinking about dying, and that he has this growing realization that he's not traveling through vacancy, but rather through something that's so full of life or so full of being that it's like making a way for their spaceship to come through. And he talks about like, back in the early 20th century, everyone was obsessed with rays, like rays of light, X-rays. There's like rays were going to be everything. Sorry about the train coming by. And so he's like, it's probably the influence of these rays that normally get blocked by the atmosphere that are doing these profoundly, that are elevating him to like a new state of life and of consciousness. And so, yeah, it's weird that we call it the space trilogy, because Lewis was not on board with the idea of space. He thought that the heavens were the right idea. That's the first inversion that he does. The second thing is, you can go and look at, say, the covers of science fiction magazines and books from the 20th century, particularly the first half of the 20th century, or like H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Everything about space that people were thinking when they thought about space, it was like, that's where the monsters live, which like I have a lot of sympathy for. I mean, like, I'm sure Peugeot would say this, like we always put monsters where we haven't seen things, right? So it's like the other planets. Why is it that like every planet is full of these like tentacled robot bugs that just want to like steal women and kill you, or like eat your brain or something, right? It's like the moment that it's the unknown, right? Space is the unknown, and it's the unknown that's trying to kill you. And so Lewis, one of the other great things that Lewis does in the first book is that he says, sure, I get that other planets are unknown, but why is it that we assume that the brokenness that we see in this world extends out past, say, the circle of the moon? And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that those two things together are really embedded in the medieval cosmology, which says that as you move towards the center of the earth, you move towards the center of sin, basically. And as you move out, you move towards increasing perfection and glory. And so the Divine Comedy is far and away the best place to look at this in the Paradiso. You've got the moon, and the moon is the last. So the moon is the most changing of the heavenly spheres. It's definitely heavenly, right? And the souls there they're blessed, right? They have the beatific vision, but they're in that heaven, that sphere of heaven, because they broke vows, right? So they were not constant. They didn't take those things that were going up top and embed them down below. They were changed by the changeableness of this world, and so they're living in the most changeable sphere. But outside the circle of the moon, that's when you get into deep heaven, right? You're past that. And so there's a second boundary that Dante has, which is at Venus. In some of these cosmological views, you have the Earth, and then you have the sun rotating around the Earth, and they knew that the sun was bigger than the Earth, right? They weren't stupid. And when you have a larger light shining, on a smaller object, you end up that shadow converges rather than diverging. And so the idea was that at some point you have this long cone of the Earth's shadow. Think about that symbolically, right? The shadow of the Earth is cast into heaven. But at some point, because the sun is so big, that stops. There's a point at which that cone terminates. And that in the Divine Comedy is at the sphere of Venus. And so everything past Venus is the planet's the sphere is completely untouched by the things of the earth. And so the souls up through Venus, there's some sort of negative taint to why they're there because of something that they didn't do quite right. Past that, it becomes this place where the souls do things like because of good things that they did, because they were martyred, because they were just rulers, because they were contemplatives, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes from you're in the lower spheres because you didn't live up to the glory of God in your life. And then past that, it's ordered by the particular instantiation of glory. And so what I think Lewis is part of the genius of the space trilogy is that Lewis is he's taking all of these ideas of the medieval cosmology that had grown stale and that people I think couldn't or didn't want to integrate with sort of the modern science fiction tropes, the modern science fiction pattern. And he puts them together, and he does it in a way where you don't even realize that it's going on at first. Like, it takes a while to realize, oh, when Ransom is kidnapped and stuck in the spaceship and taken off by the power of the Weston rays to be sacrificed to the Martians, he's actually taking us on a journey. He's taking us on a journey through a now heliocentric, at least in terms of the travel of the spacecraft, whatever, we can leave that alone. But it is a return to the medieval cosmology. And I mean, if you read The Discarded Image by Lewis, which is a great read, you'll see that like that was his project. And for those who are interested and love the Chronicles of Narnia, there is a series of books by a fellow named Michael Ward. I don't think he's a doctor. I don't think it's Dr. Michael Ward. I think it's just Michael Ward. And he says so one of them is like his academic work, and then the other one is his like put it on the bookshelf and read it whenever you want work. It's the Narnia Code is the longer one, I think. No, the Narnia Code is the short one. Planet Narnia is the longer one, where he makes to my mind, an extraordinarily strong case that the Chronicles of Narnia, each of those books, for all their apparent incongruencies, are each one of them is an attempt to, let's say, create an atmosphere that displays the influence of each of the heavenly spheres. And so he was really on this project of saying, look, the medieval cosmology, you can say what you want about its, what does Paul Vander Clay call this? Correspondence. You can say what you want about its physical correspondence, but it was saying something profoundly true about how reality is ordered. Okay, so Michael Ward, and I'm indebted to Michael Ward for this. He points out that the space trilogy, the Ransom trilogy, is written before the Chronicles of Narnia. It's actually like his rough draft in terms of dealing with how do I breathe new life into this medieval cosmology of the heavenly spheres in a modern context. And so by the time you get to that hideous strength, you actually see the planets. They come down, like at the end, they come down. The planets come down. That is, when I say planets, I mean it's not like that. What was that stupid sci-fi movie that I didn't see? The one about the Moonfall, the one where the moon crashes into the earth. Yeah, it's not Moonfall. The heavenly intelligences come down and start operating on the earth, and you get this sort of very explicit interpretation of each of these heavenly intelligences. In the Chronicles of Narnia, it's hidden, and I think in that way more effective, right? That's sort of the idea of these things that are operating above us, is that you don't meet them except in extraordinary circumstances. Most of the time you're down here, and so you're getting their influence. By the way, this is where this word comes from, right? Influenza was like the thing that was caused probably by Saturn, because Saturn's in Fortuna Major. It's like the worst, none of them are morally wrong. Saturn brings about the most ill fortune as people would consider it, right? And then there's the whole issue of why is ill fortune not bad in the sense of bad for our souls? But the flu comes from the influenza, like the influence of the planets. So in the space trilogy, they're very explicit. And so that's one of the things to pay attention to, because Mars and it's so great. It's so great. So the first one, it's Mars, and the second one is Venus, right? Or Malacandra and Paralandra. And if you're up on your medieval cosmology, particularly as it connects to the more, let's say, the alchemical and esoteric aspects, you'll know that each of the heavenly spheres corresponds to a gender. And there's two earthly genders, male and female, two genders that we see in people, the male and the female. And those are the sphere of the male of the masculine is Mars, the sphere of the feminine is Venus. And so in the first two books, he's dealing with the male and the female in that order as such, right? So that's the structure of the book is about masculinity and femininity. And then that hideous strength is the working out of how those two things are reconciled. And I'm sure people have plenty to say about that later. At any rate, So Mars is so Melicandra, the first book is about Mars, and it is it, there's so many ways you can. I mean, golly, it's a really good book. It's a really good book. So it works on all sorts of levels, right? There's a really high level where you're looking at this and you're saying, sort of what is going on, and what's going on is Ransom is encountering. It's Lewis's attempt to portray an unfallen world, and he's going to do it again in Paralandra, and he's going to make it's going to be even harder for him in Paralandra, and I think he does a really well. I will say I think he does a much more mature job of attempting to display an unfallen world in Paralandra than Milton does in Paradise Lost. And I think there's some pretty clear evidence that he was trying to do that. If you read a preface for Paradise Lost, you'll realize, like, when he wrote that, he's wrestling with all this stuff about how do you portray sinless beings? How do you portray the fall amongst, how could psychologically, how can an unfallen being be tempted? Right? Like, that's a tough question. It's a really tough question. And that's, I think Paralandra is not, it's not like a philosophical attempt at that. It is a narrative attempt at explaining how could an unfallen being be tempted. So that's one part. Out of the Silent Planet on Paralandra is different because it is the world is broken, but the rational beings there are unfallen. And so there's a very, very different dynamic. And it's essentially a question. One of the things it's answering at the highest level is how can you be good in a world that is dangerous? Yeah, that's a great, like, what is a response to danger? Like, that might be one of the main themes of the book, is like, how do we respond to the fact that the world, it will kill us? And there's something, I think there's something fundamentally masculine about that. Like, I talk about this with my wife, that at least, you can say what you want about now, but at least traditionally, men tended to face death outside and women tended to face death inside, right? So, like, childbearing, especially historically, was an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking, and men didn't have to do that. So, like, men didn't face pregnancy. They weren't going to be pregnant and then maybe bleed to death, or any of the massive number of possible complications. What they did do is they went out and they, like, fought each other. They worked with large animals that could easily kill them. They went hunting. They went on, tended to go on longer journeys, all this stuff. They kind of cut down trees, forged stuff out of metal, like everything that when you're out of this bizarre anomaly that is the modern world, most paths that men had to take were ones that are intrinsically, like, perilous to their life. And so there's a question on how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that there's danger out there? And so I won't go a whole bunch into, like, the way Lewis specifically answers that, but I think in a narrative form, I think he does a really good job of maybe suggesting a way that you might reconcile yourself to the fact that the world is dangerous. Hey, Anselman, because you're the only person that commented, you get all of my attention. So you're saying you prefer straight theological, philosophical discussion, Bible-based speculation to fantasy narratives. So yeah, I mean, that's a whole question, and I appreciate you, giving me any attention, since you prefer other things to this. Why fantasy, right? And this is one of the interesting things. Like, why? Because you had the whole explosion of the mythopoetic coming out of the Inklings, particularly. I know they weren't the only ones, but, like, in terms of what stuck around and what has, like, really influenced people. And I'm open for discussion on this, but I would consider science fiction to be a subset of fantasy, right? Like, it's a narrative structure where you're, say, creating these other rules. I think there's a lot of different ways that you could, say, defend this. I mean, one of them is just simply the fact that, like, our Lord engages with fantasy. in that he tells parables, right? He tells fictional stories as a way to get at what's true. He apparently that was worthwhile, right? He could have just quoted scripture all the time or just made theological statements about what's true, and he does those things, but like he also comes up with stories, and like stories about plants and animals, stories about people, all kinds of things. And I think part of it is that how does this work? I mean, it's the same thing that we do when we listen to each other's stories, but just like up another level, right? So you're saying, okay, why listen to a bunch of different stories? It's like, because you're trying to figure out the thing that's common across them, right? Peterson says this all the time. Vervaeke says a lot of this too. You're trying to say, what's the common thread? What was particular to my life, and then what's the common thing between all of them? This is why we like listening to people, why we ask stories. And so I think what fantasy does is it's an attempt to say, especially in a deeply like scientifically dominated worldview in which we're like the material cause and the efficient cause are everything. And so we totally get hung up on these things. It's like, stop getting hung up on them. I think in that sense, like fantasy as such is like, it's something that we really need based on the world as it is today, the place that we're in. I think you can have societies that don't need fantasy in the same way. On the other hand, there's, you have like marginalia. Like I would consider marginalia to be a form of visual fantasy, right? It's not narrative fantasy, it's a visual fantasy. Well, and shoot, like, come on, fairy tales. Like, I don't know how much people believed, like, were like ontologically true about fairy tales, but like, it wasn't the thing you saw most days. Like, that's true. Like, most of the days, like, you didn't have like gingerbread houses or people dying because of poisoned apples or going to sleep because of poisoned apples and like witches turning into dragons. Like, that's not like normal stuff ever. So why look at that? Because it's giving you the chance to get it's getting you out of the accidents of life into the essentials. That's a very like Thomistic way of saying it, and I'm fine with that. Like accidents to essentials. We're trying to get at the essentials because the great thing is like once you're up there and you see that pattern, part of the discussion between Peterson and Peugeot on fairy tales was about this, and like I thought it was a great. They made some really great points. It's like once you've done that, you can take that down and run anywhere, right? It's like, so how could I? It's the absurdity of the fact that I can read a story about some guy being kidnapped in a spherical metal ball and being hurtled across the solar system with some made up physical property called a Weston ray. Like how the fact that allows me to engage with the world in a more meaningful way is like pretty remarkable. It's really like, it's weird, but it does, it really helps out. So yes, Mark, an attempt to revive myth, but it's got too much science, so somehow a new category is created for no useful purpose. It is myth. I mean, it is it's okay. So it's a myth, but like it's more conscious mythological storytelling. Because we stopped believing in the old myths. And so what we basically said is we can't believe, I think it's something like this. We said, we can't believe in the old myths, but we're dying without them. So what are we going to do? We're going to come up with, we're going to say this is fiction, so that you don't get hung up on your propositional truths there. Hey, there's not actually elves. Hey, whatever. It's fine. You can still read the story, and so it can still feed you. Now, it is to Anselman's point, it's a lower category of story than biblical narrative. Fine, granted, it's a lower category of story. We don't spend our whole lives up here. We can't. It'd kill us. I mean, even the monks don't, right? It's like the monks who are the ones who are like the monks and the nuns, they're spending their time, as much time up here as possible. There's a father at Clear Creek Abbey who told me in his very gentle voice, he's like, here at the monastery, we try to live the angelic life. It's like, that's love. Like, cool. Wow. That's something. On the other hand, like on Thursday afternoons, they all like go out and take a walk together and just like chat about things. It's like, you can't live up here all the time. What you're doing is even the incarnation says that's not how it's supposed to happen. It's not that you cut everything out at the bottom, you bring that stuff up, right? It's the Athanasian Creed, that the incarnation happened I can never remember this. not by not it was like not by God becoming man, but by taking man into the Godhead, something like that. It's the process of trying to elevate the low things without making them not low in the proper sense anymore. And so science fiction as a subset of fantasy is like it's an attempt to get us past these things where we think we understand the basic stuff. That was the quote that had been tickling the back of my mind. Chesterton's got this great line about fairy tales where he says we tell stories about how rivers run with wine, so that for one wild moment we remember that they run with water. Right? There's this sense of needing to be reminded that reality is shocking in a good way. Like reality should be surprising to us. And so to go back to Out of the Silent Planet, right? This is sort of the idea. This is a big part of the idea of something like science fiction, good science fiction in particular. So he goes to this world where there's all like gravity is 1/3. So the mountains are incredibly tall and like the trees are weird. They're kind of like sea kelp and like the waves are weird. And, you know, they're living in these channels, these giant canals because the surface of Mars no longer supports life. And you think, okay, wow, that's really exciting. Like it'd be really cool to go to Mars where there's all this like weird different stuff. And the result is that you walk outside your door and you look around and you're like, oh, there's green trees everywhere. And there's flowers and there's like these crazy things called birds and on and on and on. And so that's part of it is it gives us the opportunity to kind of get outside of ourselves to see. Yes, we need contrast to see. We need contrast to see so that we can be made aware again of how remarkable things are. Just a second. I have to send a message. I apologize. So that's sort of what I think that's part of what fiction does. And I think myth has always done and fairy tales is it gives us that contrast to see how miraculous the world is. And when you think about the Judeo-Christian account of creation, it's that the account is fundamentally one of miracles. That creation is miraculous. Like it's ex nihilo. That's a miracle. It's something out of nothing. And so there's this sense that we've lost, particularly with this emphasis on material and this emphasis on material and efficient causes, that we lose the ability to see that reality is fundamentally miraculous. But if you go back to certain, say, parts of the liturgy, parts of scripture, parts of Christian theology, and I get the impression that maybe there's more of this in the East than in the West. I don't know. I just know what I've come across, that like the idea is not that things persist, right? This is the whole like Enlightenment deism. And you want to know how deism is different from theism. This is one of the ways that deism was, you have a creator God that sets everything up and lets it run. There it goes. You know, these things exist in their own right. And then you go back to St. Thomas Aquinas and he has these like discussions about contingency of being and ultimate being. And you're like, what is going on? I don't know what's going on. What St. Thomas Aquinas is trying to wake us up to is you look around you and you realize that everything is contingent. Nothing in and of itself explains why it exists. The whole like philosophy of being as a verb, it's like, how can you start being before you be? Well, obviously you can't. So where does that come from? There's some source of it. There's this idea that God is like deeply, deeply present in not only the creation, but the continued existence of creation, right? This is the divine logos sustaining reality. And so when we get outside of things a little bit, this was so much of my story too, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, being caught in this place where it's like this sort of materialistic necessity about the world, which kills the soul. Like it just does. And like that's really evidence of something. The fact that it makes us despair, the fact that when we look at the world and we say it has to be this way, that makes us despair of existence is like worth pondering. That should be chewed on. And so one of the things that fantasy helps us do is it helps us to, I mean, one is it gives us binocular vision, right? Like we have two eyes, we have two ears, we have two nostrils. It's like, why do we have two hands? Why is it that everything sense that we use for sensing on a biological level is bilateral, right? We don't have one eyeball. It's because I need two sets. I need to hear and hear so that I can get a differential and figure out where that sound is coming from. I need binocular vision so that slight difference in view tells me how far out something is, how big it actually is. And so storytelling is sort of this intellectual bifocal vision. It lets me know where things are coming from and how far apart they are and how big they are. And so that's one of the things. And another one I think is that it gives us the opportunity to be aware of the miraculous creation and sustenance of reality. What is this here? Is there a danger of associating Bible in people's minds too closely with fantasy stories? Might non-Christians look at this little corner, see people occupied with fairy tales, and view scripture on the same level? I mean, yeah, well, okay. I mean, there's a great point there, which is that just because something's dangerous doesn't mean it's wrong, right? There's no safety is not guaranteed. And like in my family's conversion to Catholicism, like I had this argument a lot with many of my Protestant friends, which are like, don't you see these like dangerous things about certain aspects of Catholicism? I'm like, yeah, I get that it's dangerous. Like dangerous doesn't mean it's wrong. And Lewis, again, to go back to Out of the Silent Planet, how do you reconcile yourself with the fact that reality is fundamentally dangerous? You know, it's like, oh, what was I reading? I was reading The Figure of Beatrice and this whole issue of the fact that hell exists in the Divine Comedy. It's like divine love, power, and wisdom create hell. And the divine, I'm just talking from Dante's perspective. It's like, why do divine wisdom, power, and love create hell? Because divine wisdom, power, and love create choice, and choice necessitates the possibility of hell. And so to be the kinds of beings we are fundamentally puts us in a position of danger, either physical or metaphysical danger, or both. So when you think about that, you think, okay, is it dangerous to talk about fairy tales and connect that to scripture? Yes, because someone could misunderstand it. Is it dangerous to not talk about fantasy and fiction and just look at the Bible? Yes, that's also dangerous. Like, it's not like you get to not be in danger. You know, this is one of the absurdities of the modern world is that they're like, okay. So I was thinking about this. I've started doing a lot more, like in the last several years of my life, I've started like working a lot harder with my body. Like more of my work is physical work, and like it hurts. And I frequently come home in pain. And I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking about if I lived a life that just tried to avoid pain, right? So I'm like, I don't want to physically hurt. I'm not going to move in ways that hurt me. It's like, what would happen is that my health would deteriorate. And then I would start hurting again, right? You see, there's a boundary. It's like, I could get to the point where walking upstairs hurt me as much as right now walking 3 miles would hurt me. It's like, if I can't get out of the pain. I can't get out of the pain, right? The Brave New World is essentially like, what if we took everything at our disposal and tried to create a world that didn't have pain in it? And the thing is that the more that you try to push the physical pain out, the more it becomes a form of metaphysical pain. And so the more we try to push danger out in one place, we just get it back in another. And like the meaning crisis, one way of looking at the meaning crisis is that we tried to push all the metaphysical danger out of people's lives. When you look at like the way education is taught and the morality of those systems, it's like, we don't want to be dangerous. Like we've seen what religion and people really believing things did in earlier times in history. We don't want any of that. That's too dangerous. So we're going to take all that danger out. And what happens? It's like all kinds of new danger. Hey, Adam.
Hey, Ted. How's it going?
Good, man. I don't know if we've ever met. I think I've seen you on a couple of streams before.
Yeah, I've had a few discussions with Mark on his channel, Navigating Patterns. So yeah, I'm around. But whenever you're on Father Eric's live streams, it's too late for me. It's too late for me. It's like 1 a.m. The earliest it's ever been, I think, is 1 a.m. or something like that.
Oh
for me.
My goodness, man. So have you read Lewis's Ransom trilogy?
No, I haven't. Although I've heard people talking about it. The reason why I jumped in was when you were talking about that safety aspect,
Yeah.
because I've recently come into a job, and a large portion of it, because I'm working with my hands, I'm assembling stuff in a semiconductor manufacturer, tools in there, and a lot of like all of last week for me was basically like safety training, safety this, safety that, right?
Yeah.
And look,
Yeah.
fine, fair enough. We're dealing with hydrofluoric acid and stuff. But what I realized, what I observed, right,
Yeah.
in some of this, was just how strange it was. It was like catechism. It was like when I was
Mm.
sitting during. It was a whole day.
Yeah.
What was it called? It was called Safe Pass. So this was the training. It was
Safe
called
paths.
Safe Pass.
This is the way, right?
Yeah.
They're going to show you the way to safety.
Yeah, and they had like it was like testimonies. It was like testimonies of guys who got injured during the job, and
Yeah. Yeah.
some of them were like, it was surreal, because it was like, oh, there was this guy, he was working and he didn't have his hard hat on, and so there was this massive pole that came and hit him on the back of the head, and he said, and he's fine. Like, what they say, he was fine. Like, he was injured, but like, he said, well, I wish I had my hard hat on that day, and I was like, dude, I don't think that hard hat would have saved you the injury that you got there, because it was coming down on your head.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was surreal standing. Now I'm very soft hands. I've not worked my hands very much in my life, but I was in a room full of men who had worked with their hands for their entire lives.
Yeah.
And it was weird because they made it a classroom setting and everything, and there was a kind of urgency, kind of about the zeal about how they were talking about safety. And there was always a refrain of, but is it safe? But is it safe? And it wasn't actually a question of analysis. It was a question of, it's not, is this safe? Is it good?
Is it good? Yeah. Well, and that rolls out of this whole sort of like ascendancy of human choice, which ultimately leads, the only thing that can lead you to is, we need to keep people as free and capable as possible for as much of, for as long as possible. Yeah. And so you sound like you're somewhere in the British Isles. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah.
So here I'm in Arkansas, and like biker culture is a huge thing around here, right? Sort of this whole area. And the guys that are bikers are not usually like rednecks. They're usually a bunch of like office workers that are getting into their mid 40s.
Yeah.
And so there's this great part in Out of the Silent Planet where Ransom he's met these intelligent beings that are kind of like giant otters that are extremely poetic, and they live in this like village society. Mm-hmm. He's been there for a long time, and he's learned their language. And the precipitating thing that like drives the rest of the story is there's this monster called a Hnakra he describes as basically like if a torpedo was turned into a shark. Like that's a Hnakra. And so they like live in these boats they're always in these boats, they're in the water, they're fishing. And so like a Hnakra is like, it could kill them. Like it's a big deal. But they're all super excited that a Hnakra has come. And they're like, we want like every single one they're called the Krasa. Every one of the Krasas like first in line. They want to be the one to kill the Hnakra.
Yes.
And Lewis has this great line where he has Ransom's talking with his main friend, Highway, and he's like, doesn't it bother you that there's this death in the water? And Highway says, the water would not be as warm. The sun would not be as warm, and the water would not be as sweet if we didn't know that the Hnakra was there.
Yes.
And so I was thinking about bikers, and like you have these men who have spent their whole life sitting behind desks. And then all of a sudden they're like, I want to buy something that will probably kill me. I'm going to cover myself in like black leather and like angels of death, and then plaster myself in patches in memory of the other people that have died doing this. I was like, dude, it's a death cult because they've never had real danger, physical danger in their life. They need it. Like they actually need it, because I think part of it is that like we all know on some level we're going to die, but like death is not an operational reality until you've faced death. In a sense, right? And like, it doesn't have to be doing something stupid like riding a motorcycle. It can be cancer, right? Yeah. It can be all sorts of things. Like that'll do it for you. But it's like we almost like don't have the capacity to live. This is very much in line with what Mark was saying about contrast. it's really, really hard to live without being aware that you're going to die. And so part of this reconciling ourselves to the danger of reality is exactly that. Understanding that like danger is not necessarily bad, right? And so you look at something like the virtue of courage, right? Courage is not just facing death, because there's also the vice of foolhardiness.
Yes.
And you're like, when is it courage and when is it foolhardiness? It's like, it depends.
Proper relation, proper relation to fear. That's if you look at the definitions of it or whatever, that's what it is. It's not that you don't feel fear.
Yes,
it's important to feel it, but it's important to not be moved only by that. It's to look at it. Yeah, it's to act in relation to it properly.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of like, there's this. I know this is probably, I feel like on one hand, when I say things like this, there's like a whole crowd of people that's like, I agree with you 130%. And another bunch of people are like, wow, Ted just sounds like he's been red pilled or something. But like, there is something about like masculinity that at least needs the capacity. You need consequences. You need to have a life that's like actually consequential. And so one of the things that I found really interesting, and Adam, I'll be curious how you feel about this moving forward, is I've worked in, so the two main things that I've done where it's like the people around me have a very high capacity to harm me seriously is a small scale meat processing plant, and then in a tree service, like an arborist crew.
Okay. Yeah.
So both of those are scenarios in which the people around me are entirely capable of maiming or killing me.
Yes, really. Yeah. Intentionally or unintentionally.
Intentionally or unintentionally. And what's amazing is I could have no possible further distance from those people within the same culture. They could be, I mean, they're like as far away from me as possible. And the rapidity with which I developed a sense of camaraderie and trust with them was remarkable.
Yeah.
Like a degree that you get with like one or two people when you're in university. And then you get out and you're like, I've been working with these like washed up guys in a meat facility for like a week. And I like trust my life to them on a regular basis. And so there's something about that. The fact that like you're living in a world of consequences so it's interesting in the space trilogy, I think one way you could look at the first two books is that Lewis in the first book is dealing with like physical consequences, right? How do you live in a world that has profound physical consequences? And so, because Paralandra is dangerous, Malacandra is dangerous. In Paralandra, it's Eden, like it's Eden on the planet Venus, it's on the morning star, but metaphysically it's profoundly consequential. Like it's a very dangerous place in that sense. And I think you sort of have this like internal external thing, right? Which is just, I mean, again, you're running that masculine feminine line, right? Internal, external, sort of I mean, like think about work, like in traditional societies, like men, the only way that men could work was externally. And then women, to sustain the society, there's like this profound degree of intrinsic internal work that they had to do for there to be more people. Yeah. And even then, and I know there's all sorts of variations on this and all sorts of arrangements, but like say, at least in Europe, generally speaking, there was more of men were oriented outwards out of the house, and women tend to be oriented more in towards the household, towards the hearth. And then there's sort of, again, that how do you work? Is the home safe? Right? The home is not safe, actually. The home is not, like, how many people have been hurt in their homes? And I don't mean physically, right? There's like that danger goes, it's outside and it's inside. It's Peterson talking about there's the snake outside. You get rid of all the snakes outside, and what do you find out? There's a snake inside. Right. Yeah. And so that's
possibly more dangerous, for at least for guys, because we know how to deal with the external stuff.
Yeah. But I don't know. It's all that's really interesting. So in Out of the Silent Planet, he is presenting, I think he's trying to present something like unfallen masculinity.
Okay.
So I think that's a really worthwhile way, I think, of looking at what he's doing in that book. And what's interesting is he's got three principal intelligent beings, like races there. There's the Hrasa, who are these, right? They're hunters and farmers and poets.
Okay.
And then there's these other creatures that are called the Sorns, and they're because there's less gravity, they're huge. I mean, they're like 20 feet tall, and they kind of look like giants. They're like spindly giants, but they're scholars and herdsmen. And then you have the last ones that are, there's sort of these like frog people called the Fiffletriggi, which they like make stuff. They just love making stuff. And it is interesting when you see that overlay onto the dwarves, the elves, and the hobbits in Tolkien. And you're like, oh yeah, like there's some imaginative similarity there. But in comparison to Paralandra, where it's this very like deeply relational story, it's really about these relationships that are going on. You get this much more like, I think he's trying to present something like a view of how can we as people live in the world, like not just live in the world, operate in the world, operate on the world in a way that's not intrinsically negative to it. Which I think is like, I don't know how you feel over there, but like I feel like that's a question that a lot of people like wrestle with. It's like anything I do is bad. It's all like colonizing or destructive.
Yeah,
like,
we recently, Mark mentioned this. I still haven't found the story, but I do think it probably did happen. There was basically a mass culling of cattle in Ireland because of CO2, greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, Ireland is a big farm, and we just like there was 100,000, 300,000 cattle to. Mark said to Gaia, and I was like, yeah, pretty much. I mean,
that is exactly right. I mean, that's totally how you should see it. It's like, oh, well, we're just doing the rational thing. It's like, what do you mean the rational thing? Like, no, you're making a sacrifice to the earth, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
well, look, it's what they were taught in catechism. After their safety catechism, they got their Gaia catechism, probably in university, actually.
Yeah, and it's so interesting too, Adam. I mean, like this is part of the world that I've run into, circles I've run in is in regenerative ag. And like, if you spend any time looking at like, we need an answer to say the ecological, I'm not even going to say climate damage, ecological damage of bad management of cattle. That's real. Like that's really real. Is the only answer to kill all the cows? It's like, of course not.
No.
Why would you do that? Why would you decide the only way is to kill the cows? I think it's because we don't believe there's a way for us to properly interact with ecology.
Yes. Yeah, there's no proper relation between man and creation.
Yeah, which again, I think Out of the Silent Planet is sort of an imaginative, to go back to like, why is fantasy helpful? It's like fantasy in one ways is helpful that it lets us start to believe something that we can't see yet. And so you might not be able to see how can rational beings like humans like come into right relation with say our ecological reality. And in one sense, you have to believe that that's possible before you can figure it out. Otherwise, you just end up going out and like gassing the cows.
Yeah.
It's like, and if you were so dang concerned about quote unquote nature, like how do you think the cows felt?
Right. Well, that's for Gaia to decide.
That's for Gaia to decide. It's like, okay, so just as like a really interesting aside, when I was in grad school for a couple of years and then I quit.
Yeah.
In the ecology department here. And I don't know if you know, there's actually like, I think in the 70s, this ecologist put out some books on like the Gaia hypothesis, which was, there's the soft Gaia hypothesis, which says that the planet should be viewed as though it were an organism or an entity.
Okay.
So that's the soft, it says there's no real ontology there, but like it's worthwhile thinking about it that way. Then there's the hard Gaia hypothesis, which says that like the planet and the biosphere really are a single entity. Like think Avatar. And I remember sitting around with my lab mates at one point, and before something, and they're talking about how they wished that they could believe the Gaia hypothesis was true.
Oh wow!
So like, yeah, like when you've been smoking some pot or like had enough to drink, you can almost believe it.
Yeah.
And I was like, that is like one of the most heartbreaking things ever. It's like,
they're almost there. But
they're almost
really.
Right. And so one of the things that say Out of the Silent Planet can do, if you look at it from this direction, is say, I don't see how we could have that level of integration. I see it as like us us or the cows.
Yeah.
Right. It's Earth or the cows, really, or the Earth or us. We're killing the cows instead of us too, by the way. Right. It's like, if we're really the problem, why do we? It's like, there's plenty of people who are already going in that direction. I don't even want to joke about it. But like for now, we're like, hey, maybe if we kill enough cows, we'll be allowed to live here again.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is if you actually believe that there's a point of integration, then what you end up is something much more like regenerative agriculture, where you're saying, look, we're not a burden. We have a cost. We have an inescapable cost.
Yeah.
We have an inescapable cost of our existence because we're embedded material. We're hylomorphic beings. We're spiritual and we're material. It's like we have a material cost on the world. How do we justify our existence? And this is a little bit down the rabbit hole. I think the reason that people don't want to believe that they have an ecological impact on the world is because they don't want their life to have to measure up to that cost.
Yeah.
It's like, if I don't cost anything, I can do whatever I want.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. So there's, I mean, and I think it to some degree it actually goes back to the safety thing as well. Because another thing I noticed when I was in that safety course was I thought none of this would be one of the things he mentioned. Actually, I mentioned it, but of course, like I just mentioned it because it's like, well, that's another thing. He said, what's the cost of an accident on site or whatever. Yeah. And we were going through like cost to the company, insurance, blah blah blah, to the person who's happened to, and then I said, what about their family? Like what if the dude wants to go home safely to his wants to come home to his family and not have to be like disabled, right? And it was like that was almost that it wasn't like there was no countenancing it, but I looked around me and I saw men who largely either were they have their family and that's fine, they care about that anyways, but a lot of the young men, it was like they don't really have a family to go back to, so it was never even at the forefront of it. It's like to some degree, this sort of safety, on-site safety, could almost sort itself out in the sense of guys having to like, I want to work and then I'm going to come home and actually do the real work of raising my family, loving my wife, and providing for them.
Yeah, which I to go back to this idea of danger, living in a dangerous world. There is this sense in which, because of our concupiscence, because we're not all there, right? We're not where we should be. Like we have to be. Gratitude becomes an incredibly difficult problem for most people. And in the Catholic Mass, you have like the preface, where it starts with lift up your hearts. We have lifted them up to God. Lift up your hearts to God. We have lifted them up. Let us give thanks. Like it is right and just. It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, everyone at all times to give you thanks, O Lord. It's like, yes. In the middle of the Mass, you have this like, it's like gratitude is related to our salvation. Like it is, how can I put this? Gratitude is an ontological necessity. And part of, I think, our ingratitude is, I mean, you hear this, it's like to the point that it's like, we can't hear it anymore. It's like, what happens when people face death? They will go home and they hug their families, or they talk about how grateful they are that they're alive.
Yes.
And so if you never think that you can die, then it becomes incredibly hard to be thankful. But it's further than that, Adam, right? So it's like, if you don't think that it's worth risking your life to work for your family, or you don't think it's worth risking your life to raise children, then you can't be great. It's like so hard to be grateful to the other person that you're engaged in this project with, right? Right. It's like, when my wife realizes that like I have gone out and whatever the risk is, it was a real risk, and I did that because I care about them, because I want them to be alive. It's like, oh, you've got skin in the game for this. Yeah. I can thank you for that. And vice versa. And so there's this way in which like I don't want to go back to the world in which it's really, really easy for people to die. I don't. But like we have to be aware that when that changed, it became incredibly easy for us to trivialize the things that we do for each other because the cost became a lot more hidden. I'm not going to say it went away, but it became a lot more hidden. And so now like you have to have this process. And so I just read, do you know Ernest Shackleton, who Ernest Shackleton was?
Yeah. One of his crewmates actually lived around where I live. Tom.
Get out. Do you remember which one it was?
Tom Crean, that's his name.
Yes.
He was from Cork, actually. Ernest Shackleton lived here, actually. Shackleton Road is just like outside my house.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. So I just finished rereading Endurance for the like third or fourth time.
Yeah.
And I mean, the story is incredible. And you think about like, or so they go off on this Antarctic expedition and they're going to try to cross the pole. And then the ship gets stuck in the ice and destroyed. And Shackleton manages to get all of his men out alive back to the exact same island where they were. It was like, what, a year and a half earlier or something?
Yeah.
And you think he didn't do anything, right? He just like wasted a ship and a bunch of food to go like sit on an ice floe for like 18 months. But to take that video that from Jordan Peterson that Jacob loves playing, he's like, you're asking the wrong question. Like, how can you look at what Shackleton did and all of those men and the sacrifices and the bravery they showed and be like, yeah, that was a waste of resources. Like, if you can say that, something is wrong with you.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's part of it. But the other part is like, I finished reading it and, and they show up at Elephant Island. Like,
they have to cross it as well. They come on the opposite side to where the base is, so they have to cross it.
Oh my goodness. Well, no. So this is after Shackleton's made it to the whaling station. He comes back to get his men, the men that they left when they went on the solo boat journey through the through the Southern Ocean. I mean, the whole thing is so crazy, dude. The whole thing is
absolutely crazy.
But when they see the rescue boat there, it's like even better than that. Even better than that, it's when they get back to the whaling station and they talk about all those old whalers in that room. And it's like, no one had any awards. No one had authority to give them medals or anything like that. But these Norwegian whalers came up and they're like, we want to shake the hand of a man who made that journey.
Yeah.
And it is like, if you don't engage with those kinds of things, it's actually, I don't know that level of like mutual respect and love can exist. And and you think about like, this is Peugeot's whole point, right? If you listen to his talk from Chino, it's like, who enjoys a meal more? The billionaire sitting down to his like, 50th, incredible, perfectly done, everything is flawless. His like chef, he's paying $1 million a year. It's like, or the monk who hasn't eaten in 3 days and he gets a piece of bread.
Yeah.
You think about like reading the descriptions of Shackleton's party when they arrive on the island with a whaling station before they've even made it to the whaling station. They know they're going to have to cross because the rudder's destroyed.
Yeah.
And they eat those birds that they harvest. Like they're just, and it's like, they've like probably just like boiled it in a pot with some water off of a glacier. And they're like raving about how good it tastes. It's like the degree of bliss that they describe of just being on solid ground. I was like, when was the last time I was grateful for being on solid ground? It's like, but I've read. And so again, why would you read fiction? Why would you read fantasy? It's like, I get that Shackleton's not fiction. And that's, and so it's great in that way. But like, even reading that, like I have a little bit, I get to share in it a little bit. Just a little bit, just this much. I get to think, I had a bed. My house is not possibly going to fall into the Antarctic Ocean at any time. Yeah. It's like, I'm not worried that I'm not going to eat it if a seal doesn't poke his head through the ice. It's like, I'm dry. Like my body, I've been dry, like basically whenever I want to be dry. I'm not like living in a rotting reindeer sleeping bag. There's this, it just like those stories afford us this capacity for gratitude in such a profound way. Yeah.
And I think it's connected with sacrifice as well, though, because there's gotta, and sacrifice, there's some risk involved in some sense, because it's otherwise in some sense it's not a sacrifice, it's just cheap talk.
Yeah. And to see, just to see and then this is I like this that Mark said right here. How do you train to prepare for death if you aren't getting close and dealing with it as a real possibility, just like you train for anything else? And the thing is like you can read stories, same thing with POW, for World War II POWs, the gratitude, the intense gratitude that they have coming out of those camps. I mean, it's heartbreaking. Like it'll make you cry very easily, but like, that's not where they stayed. they still had to live the rest of their lives. And so I think that's a lot of like, why do we come back to these stories? Because like, even when you live through it, you have to keep rehearsing that, to the point of the Jews. It's like, what are they supposed to remember? Jacob could tell me right off the bat what the 10 things that Israel is supposed to remember. But like the two big ones, like, remember the Lord your God is one, and he brought you out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Why do you remember? Like, you have to remember he brought you out of Egypt over and over and over and over. You have to remember it because you're going to forget. It's like, Shackleton probably did not spend the rest of his life thinking, I'm so glad I'm off those icy floes. It's like there's a discipline to learning how to live in that state of gratitude. And I don't even know, to Mark's point, aside from the spiritual disciplines that the Christian traditions have always held out, and I think that are true, and there's other disciplines and other religious traditions that are really worthwhile as well. I mean, there's just like because that's human nature. I'm not going to speak to like this is how you do it, but I think there's a degree of like awareness of what's good in your life. There's enough to be grateful for in your life that you can practice. You can work on that without having to go out and like say seek a close encounter with death. You don't have to go be a biker or do wingsuit base jumping.
Yeah. Yeah, or climb on skyscrapers. You ever see those videos of those dudes who just like just sneak into the construction site while it's on and climb up to the top of a crane? And you think, you think, wow, that's pretty serious. And for me, I'm like, that looks kind of cool though. That looks kind of,
yeah.
But at the same time, it's terrifying because it's like, yeah, but a stiff breeze is just you'll get to right to the tip top of the crane and then stand up.
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember about 10 years ago thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and realizing that it was a bunch of pot because people do all kinds of crazy stuff to get meaning. That'll totally kill them. That'll kill them dead or make them really hungry. It's like, that's like a rough outline for kind of how things work. But like, people starve themselves for meaning. I think that like the whole free running thing, like that's another great example of like, we feel that our lives are so diminished in danger that we go out and look for it so that we can
restricted in terms of in terms of how you go around the world compared to like just a village where you could walk anywhere pretty much.
Well, think about again, realizing, and it's not even like this is the thing though. It's not like our lives have less consequences. Our lives have profound consequences. They're just not like the immediate consequences of like not taking the shot right when the bear is about to get at you, or not being a good swordsman in a medieval battle. Like there are very immediate consequences in those situations. We have all kinds of consequences in our lives. We just don't see them as clearly, and so they get hidden from us. Maybe instead of taking out liturgy, the church needed to add danger time practices. This is what I think that this is what Grimwald Grizz is trying to get at with paintball, right? That's a danger type practice. Like paintball is great because it has real consequences, and like you're going to get hurt really badly if you do a bad job of it. And like again, I think you can see a lot of this in sports as well. The more full contact sports, all of this stuff. I mean, I know you guys, especially Australian rugby.
Yeah. Like, well, see, with American football, you got all that padding and stuff. Like you could just be fat and you'll be grand. Whereas our rugby players, they have to like they become professional now recently. So like they have to be tall, but they're also like thick with muscles. So that and they're like grab each other and pull each other. You'll see that they all have cauliflower ears. Fighters.
Well, Adam, that's actually a great example of this whole like trying to hide danger thing, right? Because you say, oh, well, American football players, they're all padded up and they're fine and they're protected from danger. And then what we found out is actually they're not. The shock from those repeated concussions, because they're covered in protective gear, where they're slamming these 300-pound bodies into each other, causes long-term brain degeneration.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, look, we fixed the danger problem.
But you haven't really. You just made it look as though you have.
Right. And so what's interesting is that you actually like to take that, and I don't know how far you could take that, but like if you said, Ted, would you rather break an arm 3 times or have degenerative brain failure when you turn 35? I would be like, break my arm. 100% break my arm.
Yeah.
So it's like, which one, in which case you're facing a more like fundamental danger? It's when you're playing professional American football rather than like playing rugby, because you feel the consequences so quickly, it doesn't go as far.
Yeah.
And I think that we should, boy, this gets into like, how do you be grateful for the fact that like life is perilous, and like part of it is that like, peril saves us from, I mean, think about like, have you ever read about there's people who don't have pain, like they can't feel pain.
Yeah, they lack pain receptors.
They lack pain receptors, and you know what they're like?
What?
They're like covered in scars, and like
because they don't realize they're
misset bones. Yeah, because like your pain is there for a reason. They're getting like burned and slashed and broken bones all the time. Like it's actually an insanely dangerous condition to have.
Yeah.
You're like,
because you're not aware. You're not aware of what you're doing to your body, and you're not getting that feedback.
You're not getting that feedback. Exactly. And so I think to Mark's point, I don't know exactly what he means by danger type practices. I don't know if he means like, yes, this is exactly, Mark. Anti-fragility is exactly what I'm talking about. And you start raising children, you realize like children are profoundly anti-fragile. Like if you want to see something that is anti-fragile, look at a child. It's like you can push them too far. Undoubtedly, you have to protect them. If you don't ever let them fall and skin their knees, like they have.
Yeah.
That's
something I'm very skeptical of when parents try to round off everything, and it's like, I kind of, I look back at my childhood, and it's like that's what mine looked like a lot more, and actually I'm kind of the worst for it, because I've never broken a bone in my life, and it's like I don't know how I'd deal with that. I mean, hopefully I wouldn't I wouldn't end up crying, wah! But it's important, because you need to know your limits. And in that sense, it's my limits are somewhat unbounded because of that.
Yes. So I think you could view, one good way to view sort of like the basic spiritual disciplines, from taking the Catholic tradition of fitting in the category of giving, prayer, and fasting, right? So you're giving things up, you're giving up your time and attention in prayer, and then you're fasting, you're abstaining from things. All of those cause spiritual pain. In a real sense, like they do. And if you don't experience that spiritual pain, you can be in a profound danger of like walking off a spiritual cliff, right? It's like there's a direct line from the way that physical pain protects you from killing yourself, and the way that spiritual pain and spiritual disciplines protects you from killing yourself spiritually.
Yeah.
Like it's the same thing. And so you want, like in the same way that physically you hurt yourself in small ways, like exercising, because exercise hurts.
So that you don't, muscles.
So that you don't die, right? Of like heart failure or something like that. Like, it's just like, it's not complex. Yeah. It's like, you're an anti-fragile being. Like you need to have that. And so this idea that, there's 1,000 things I could say, but Out of the Silent Planet, one of the things I love about it is like, it presents the peril of the world as being, it is a danger. Well, C.S. Lewis's friend Sheldon Van Delken wrote a book called A Severe Mercy. And I think that phrase is excellent. The peril of the world is a severe mercy. It's like, you have to, it's hard to see it. But then once you see it, you realize it's a mercy. He's talking about losing his wife. Like Sheldon Van Delken, he's like, the whole title is in a reference to him becoming a widower and wow. His process of grieving and coming to terms with the fact that like that death was a severe mercy in his life. And I think what we want, like ultimately, is we want, you could call it happiness, you could call it shalom, you could call it blessedness. Like we want blessedness. Like that's what we want. We want life. And if you're going to have that, there's two ways to try to pursue that. One is to try to get rid of all the danger and the pain in your life. The other one is to somehow integrate all of the danger and pain in your life into that blessedness. Yeah. And I'm just like, the first one just doesn't work.
It's not going to happen because I mean, look, if you look at the origin of the English word happy, and this is Mark says it, it doesn't like it as a translation, and I don't like it either because I looked it up. It's like happiness in English means fortunate.
Yes.
And if you read any of the Stoic literature or any ancient literature, they're like, do not rely on fortune.
Yes.
If good fortune comes, that's okay, but that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for, and like in something like Seneca, he'll say, the contented man.
Yes.
Or the
yes.
blessed man, right?
Well, and I think about the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, where it says, consider hardship as the Lord's discipline, and basically by that you'll know that you're a son of God. Right? Like, you know that you're a son of God when you're being disciplined. And Mark, exactly, Mark. And happiness. Here's the thing though, right? If you run after happiness, my wife and I were just talking about this, like running after happiness is the surest way to not be happy.
Yes.
It's so if there's one fact that we have established empirically about human beings, it's that to elevate happiness to the primary place is to ensure that you will not be happy. And so like in Hebrews, that to me, to my understanding, like that is the path to integrating all of those things, is doing whatever is necessary. And I get that this is very much in line with what the Stoics are saying too. And John Vervaeke was talking about this at Chino. I mean, he calls it like the meta-optimal stance. It's what's the stance that you don't know what's happening on the horizon. Like, what position can you get in that will give you the best probability of responding appropriately to whatever it is that comes, right? Whatever it is that comes through that door, right? Yeah. It's like that you are men of Gondor, whatever comes through that gate, you will stand your ground. It's like, what is that inside of you that says whatever comes through the gate, you're going to stand your ground?
Yeah, weather the storm.
Yeah, it is something like the capacity to see the purgatorial aspect in hardship, that it has the capacity to move you, and I would I'm just going to use the language that I believe is true. When combined with grace, like when you have grace, you then have the capacity to understand that hardship as a blessing. And that's the Hrasa in Out of the Silent Planet, where they say, the world would not be as sweet to us if there were not death lurking in the waters. And you think, is that resignation or is that holiness? And it's like, I'm pretty sure that's holiness.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's the healthy look, like, view on it, and actually coming back to it, like that holiness comes from health, right?
Yes.
Coming back to safety, a lot of problems you see with people is that they're being medicated before symptoms show, and that makes them weaker. That actually exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, that health comes from embracing the fact that you're an anti-fragile being, and physically and spiritually, and it must be. And again, like to bring in more of like this little corner's language, like opponent processing is an embrace of anti-fragility on an intellectual level. It says that the most growth is going to come out of the sort of expansion and then pruning, right? Like you have to prune to go back to regenerative agriculture. Like the two, you have like Joel Salatin, right? It's disturbance, rest. That's how you heal a landscape, Adam. If you want to heal a landscape ecologically, you cannot leave it alone. Mm-hmm. Some landscapes you can. It's periodic disturbance. This is like they found this about like in the 60s in ecology. They were looking at, it's super cool that the kind of the fundamental paper was looking at tidal pools on the west coast of the US. And so you have like at the top, you have like a little bit of water, in the intertidal region, you get wet a little bit of the day, but most of the time it's hot and dry. And then down at the bottom, it's like wet all the time. You're just pounded by waves. In the middle region, you have, this is one of Mark loves this one. In the middle region, you have this optimal level of disturbance. And when you look at mollusk and starfish diversity, it's highest in the middle region. And we found this, it's basically, if there's one universal law of ecology, it's basically this one. It's periodic disturbance leads to the greatest level of diversity. Mm-hmm. And so like Joel Salatin and all these regenerative grazers realize that if you leave a pasture alone, it gets scrubby. If you have cows, if you have grazing animals on it all the time, they'll burn it out. But if you put them on it 2 or 3 times a year really quickly, and then leave it alone and you let it rest, and it's funny. I think about this all the time. Like I am trying to listen to like less podcasts and stuff from this little corner during the week because like I want that period of processing. If I'm just like, here's all this stuff, like stuff to work on
constantly
all
being
the
put in.
time.
Yeah.
There's no ability for that to recover and integrate. But then I want to come and like bring it forward and have it disagreed with or nuanced or whatever. And this other guy down in Brazil, Ernst Gotch, who is, I mean, I could talk for hours about his work. It's absolutely fascinating. But he does agroforestry, so agriculture, tree-based agriculture. And his like number one thing is like the way to drive the positive health of a forested ecosystem is by pruning.
Mm-hmm.
Like cut wood all the time. And he's got fascinating examples of like in just totally non-human ecosystems that like monkeys will prune trees. They'll go in and they'll like prune buds off of trees. Birds will do the same thing too. You have in the woods in Arkansas, you have these beetles that will go and they'll cut the twigs off of trees as well. You know, we also get wildfire disturbance and wind.
Yeah.
And if you got a wildfire every year, you'd have a grassland.
Mm-hmm.
But if you never have wildfires, then you actually, I mean, in our particular area, they found that like because we completely suppressed wildfires, there's no understory growth, and so there's no macro vertebrate. There's no large vertebrates. You get a few squirrels living off of the acorns, and that's it. But then when you start doing periodic burns, you open things up enough, and guess what happens? You get all sorts of wild mice and rats and rabbits come in, and then that goes all the way up the food chain. You've got your mammalian and avian predators, and this whole thing is like there has to be frequent disturbance. You can't burn it down, but you can't also say no danger, no damage.
Yeah, yeah,
hold it all
and it's
out.
artificial. Necessarily that no, it's artificial by suppressing the wildfires. That's external action. That's kind of making that. It's kind of like the artifice of Cain or something to kind of come in and say no, we'll manage this. You know, there's no room for God here. No, we're managing it down to the smallest creature.
Which is like, to take Peterson's language, right? It's the over masculine approach to the world, to relating to the world, right? You're like, no, we're going to order all of it. Like it's going to be completely ordered because we don't trust chaos. We don't trust that chaos can bring goodness into the world. It's like antinatalism. I think that fundamentally antinatalism comes out of our distrust that reality is fundamentally good, right? Because what is more fundamentally unpredictable than bringing another person coming into the world? You have no idea who that person is. And if you don't think that the structure of reality is fundamentally good, if you don't think that being is fundamentally good, you do not trust that it would be better for another person to be in the world. You just can't trust it.
No.
And so the same reason that we stop wildfires from happening here on a high level, not the low level of things like we don't want people's houses to burn down. But again, right? Can you get rid of the danger, Adam? Of course you can't. Because when you suppress the wildfires, what happens to them?
Well, like they're gone. Like they're
no, not out west. They get really huge.
Oh yeah, you get an over
You get monster wildfires. Same thing in Australia. You're like, we're not going to burn. We're not going to burn things because burning is bad. And then what happens? It still burns. It burns less frequently, and when it goes, no one can stop it.
Yeah, it's the illusion of control to think that there's something like nature, right? That kind of you can manage.
So I'm
like
not
an office building.
For anyone that hasn't read the Ransom trilogy, I'm not going to ruin it. But that idea that you push nature down with control long enough and it blows up in your face, that's the end of the story. The whole story. I mean, it's wonderful. Like the way Lewis writes it is so great. It's like you can push on reality and it'll give, right? This is the thing about it is like there's a lot of buffer in reality, and that's actually a mercy. But if we're not wise enough to see that it's a buffer, we'll think it's a pattern, right? Oh, we can destroy these institutions and society hasn't fallen apart. It's like, for how long exactly, right? Yeah. We can pave over everything and the world hasn't fallen apart. Yeah, for how long? It's like we can build a society based around the idea that everyone should indulge all of their desires whenever they want to. And it works. Society hasn't fallen apart. It's like, for how long?
For how long?
Right? It's like
Rome's a good example of that. If you want to see how it plays out in the long term, just read any history of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. That's the thing, man, is that you like, this is the book of Job. Like, this is so much of the book of Job in my mind, is that like, You cannot approach the world from a consequentialist mindset. It will kill you.
Mhm.
Because the consequence, because God, look, because God is good and he's merciful to us. And so he doesn't, you can say this however you want. Reality does not smite us the moment we misbehave. It doesn't.
No. Yeah.
And that's good. It's
Mhm.
good because we're foolish and we're weak. And so we need time and we're given
Yeah.
that time. But the peril of that is that we get into a habit of thinking that grace period. I mean, think about the phrase grace period. That grace period is the pattern, and it's not.
No.
And so it's like you have to be wise before it kills you.
Yeah. This was a smaller conversation I was having on Bridges of Meaning earlier was kind of on that point, because they were talking about the Inferno, and they were talking about Paolo and Francesca.
Yes.
And the fact that, like, oh, lust wasn't all that big of a deal. It's like, okay, sure, but that's actually, in terms of theirs wasn't merely an act of lust, because it actually, there was if you read up like the wiki page on it, it's like there was a sustained affair. And
Yes.
actually, that kind of bowls over into being a traitor. In some sense, they're more like Judas than they are the person who gives in to that momentary, momentary pleasure.
That's
Because they broke that grace period. It was like they kept on doing it, and then the husband, who is the brother of one of the adulterers, and then the husband to the other, walks in and kills them. It's like that's where the grace period ends.
Yes, is where the spear comes. And like it's like, okay, again, why do you read this stuff? Because you only have one shot at getting lanced because you're committing adultery with your brother's wife, right?
Yeah.
Once you get lanced doing that, it's over.
You're
so
done.
How do you, because look, either you don't face the consequences or the consequences destroy you, right? This is where did Mark say this? Right here. Lots of small shocks make things stronger, living things in particular. Large shocks destroy things. Oh, that's a small shocks. It's like, look, there are certain things that you can do that the only possible consequence is enough to destroy you. So how do you keep from doing those things? It's like you read the stories. I mean, this is I like Peterson says it in an interesting way. He says, like, we have these ideas and we run them out there and we see what happens, and we let our ideas die instead of us. Mm-hmm. Oh, I could do that, and then that might happen, and that might. It's like, well, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm going to have faith that my wisdom actually is teaching me that is a bad path. That's not the right path. In fact, it's such a bad path. You know, it's like the idea that, like, well, I'm going to find out if heroin is a bad idea or not by trying it.
Yes.
It's no. Heroin is a matter of faith. Like, it's actually a matter of faith. And, like, you know, this is one of the interesting things about the garden, right? He's like, he's like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you say, except that God already gave them a command to not eat from it. So, like, they actually have a moral framework. So what are we talking about when we say the knowledge of good and evil? It's like, it's the experiential, it's the participatory knowledge of evil. Yes. Like, you can't, there's no way to have that without it changing you in a way that you can be given this sort of right? You can have it on the wisdom level, and it has very little capacity to hurt you. But when you have that experiential knowledge of things, right? So to Vervaeke's point, like, participatory knowledge is incredibly powerful for good and for ill. You have to have wisdom to know about what you should participate in.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing that Peterson says, of beware of unearned wisdom, because you don't want to earn it. Because you might be tempted to earn it.
Yes. Yeah. And then also because when you're hearing it from someone else and they haven't earned it, you have no idea.
Yeah.
Like, what do you know, right? It's like, what do you know? How do you know if it's gonna sustain you in the end? I had this. This came up in a conversation with my brother recently, and I've been thinking about it a lot. In university, there was a lecture on a guest seminar on this researcher who'd worked with cliff swallows in the northern Great Plains of the U.S. And they used to just nest on these limestone cliffs, and there's not that many of them. And so you'd have these, like, a few small colonies, and then we came in as we started building bridges. So you've got these big concrete or steel girders with overhangs, perfect for building the mud nest for cliff swallow. So that the population exploded, and they've got these colonies are bigger than they've ever been before. And he was studying it as this shift was happening in the population. What they would go in and they would fumigate half of a colony, and then they'd look at um, fledgling development and survival rates.
Mm-hmm.
On the fumigated side and the non-fumigated side, what they were doing is they were killing all the nest parasites. And the reason they were doing that is because the bigger the nesting colony was, the more parasites there were, because you had more birds bringing parasites in.
Yeah.
Okay, so what they found the first time was that when they fumigated the one side of the colony, the side that was fumigated, the growth rates were much higher and the survival rates were much higher. And what they concluded was that these big colonies are actually detrimental to the population of cliff swallows, because the babies can't develop because all their blood's being sucked by these lice.
Parasites, yeah.
Right. Great. We learned what's going on there. No. So he came back, and this is what's fascinating. He came back like 20 or 30 years later and started doing more studies with grad students. And what he found was, when they did the studies like a quarter of a century later, is when they fumigated half the colony, there was no difference.
Okay.
The birds had to, and there were still the parasites there, but they had developed a degree of tolerance, not resistance, tolerance to the parasites, that they could successfully grow and fledge.
Okay, because the population had already grown, and so you leave that for a couple of decades, and then you come back and it's normalized.
Yeah. The adaptive pressure on them was so strong that it didn't take long at all. It just took, and they also found that the birds stopped getting hit by cars, because initially there are all these car kills, and some grad student was like, I really need some specimens for a project. He goes, don't worry about it. There's going to be dead birds everywhere. And what happened is, when they showed up, there was like no dead swallows. They weren't getting hit by cars anymore.
They're not getting hit by cars. They're adapting now. Yeah.
They went back and they looked at all their specimens they collected, because when they found them dead, they'd take them to their specimen collection. They found out that the wings had gotten slightly shorter over time, because it made them more maneuverable. When they had shorter wings, they were more maneuverable and they could escape the cars. And you're like, so there's two things there. One is, again, you can see all of these patterns about how peril is actually making the population more robust. And if the negative things aren't too strong, then they can adapt to it. If they are too strong, it'll just destroy the population. The much more fundamental thing, Adam, is that you could not predict from the beginning what was going to happen without really high level wisdom. If you just took the first 3 or 4 years and you're like, oh, we see how this works, you'd be dead wrong.
You're trying to science it. You're going to arrive to the conclusion very late.
Right. And so I think that, like, this is what so much of what the wisdom of the book of Job is about. You look at your own life and you say, okay, I know that, say the ancients have said this thing here is wrong, but I've been doing it for 2 years and it's been going great for me.
Right.
What do you do with that? Have you proved them wrong?
You should be waiting to get slapped. I mean,
maybe so. Maybe you should be waiting to get slapped. And it's like Francesca and Paola is such a great example of that, because it's like they'd been doing this thing and it's like, hey, there's no consequences to this. And it seems really great. And then someday the lance comes through that, it's like, and like pins you both to the bed and you're like, oh my, okay, now there's consequences. All of a sudden there's consequences. So that, well, man, we could get into the Divine Comedy for hours, but that to me is like the other half of realizing that the world is perilous, is that it helps you be grateful, but it also demonstrates the utter necessity for wisdom. If the world is not dangerous, you don't have to be wise. But if the world is dangerous, then you have to be wise, because danger does not work in the way where there's just like one-to-one, I get my wrist slapped. It's like, no, sometimes you just get punched right out the door.
You don't have control over that. Again, it's when and it's kind of bundled up with the desire to be happy, because if you want to be fortunate, that's okay, but that'll never happen. That will never happen, because fortune is a fickle master.
Yes. Well, I actually really like that description. I can't remember where it is in the Divine Comedy, but she's described as a heavenly intelligence who spins her wheels, and she is in her beatitude beyond all the complaints and gratitude of the people of the earth.
Yeah.
She's just like in her blessedness. She's just throwing some people down and picking some people up. And she does it so that man realizes that they're not in control, so they turn towards God. And she in her blessedness is above all of the gratitude of the fortunate and the curses of the unfortunate.
Wow.
So Adam, I'm going to have to wrap this up. Thanks so much for jumping on.
No problem. I enjoyed it. I actually wanted to talk to you for a while, but ever since Go Dog Go, which I got 3 copies of. I got 3 copies of after that talk with Father Eric, and they
Yes.
were all the wrong editions because I think the one you have is paper, and I had the little kind of like card one
Yes.
for like earlier readers, and it was all chopped up and out of order. So
Someone else was telling me about that. Yeah, you have got to get the unabridged version.
unabridged. Yeah, no, I got an idea. I'm gonna fix that. I'm gonna write that. I'm gonna get 6 of those proper versions now.
There it is. Yeah. Well, that's so much fun, man. Hey, enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
You too.
And all y'all in the comments, Mark, Anselman, see Williams on. Thank you guys for hanging out. This is a lot of fun. Yeah, had a really good time. God bless all of you and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
God bless.